First of all, a very touched the lake, and a very good evening to all the ladies and gentlemen over here. May I first request everyone to kindly put your mobile phone on silent. Thank you. Well, my name is Tenzin Legman, and I feel privileged to extend my warm welcome to all gathered here to our 33rd annual Padmabani lecture on India and on the relation between India and Tibet from 1947 to 1962. So this annual Padmabani lecture is one of the important academic events of Tibet House, as they are delivered by leading scholars among all around the world who have made an outstanding contributions in their respective fields. The title of lecture series evokes the idea of universal understanding and harmony. So before we proceed with the main event of today, I would like to give a brief introduction about Tibet House, cultural center of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, New Delhi, was established in 1965 by His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama of Tibet for the purpose of preserving the cultural heritage of Tibet. Over a period of 5 decades since its inception, Tibet House has come to recognize as a significant institution for the dissemination of Tibetan culture and for Buddhist studies. Tibet House has a museum of valuable Tibetan arts and artifacts as well as library. Every year, a publication unit from Tibet House publishes around 10 to 15 books a year, and program division which regularly organizes lectures, seminars, conference, film screenings, and exhibitions. As you can see on the screen, Tibet House offers 4 different courses on Buddhist philosophy, psychology, and Tibetan language course. So these are the 4 courses as you can see on the screen. Nalanda Master Course, which is a 5 years course, Nalanda Diploma Course, which is a 14-month course, Nalanda Certificate Course, which is 2 months course, and Tibetan Language Course, which is 4 months course. Nalanda Master Course, which was first launched in 2016, and it's a 5-year course, and secondly, Nalanda Diploma Course, which was launched on 2018, and till now we have successfully completed with 3 batches, and the 4th batch of the Nalanda Diploma Course has already started in March. And recently, we have a 2 months Nalanda Certificate Course, which is being offered to those students who wish to acquire a basic foundation of Nalanda Buddhist philosophy. And till now, we have successfully completed the first batch of Nalanda certificate so far. And for the Tibetan language course, which is both online and offline, till date, 3 batches have successfully completed, and 24th batch, till now, 23 batches successfully completed, and 24th batch has already started in December 2022. We'll now start with the main event of today, and I would like to request our chairperson for today's session, Dr. Amarjiva Lochan Ji, Joint Dean of International Relations at the University of Delhi, and our speakers for today's event, Mr. Claude Arpi, author and historian, to kindly come on the stage and take your respective seats. Now I would like to request Tibet House Secretary, Mr. Kunjabla, to kindly come on the stage and address the gathering.
Tashidilek and good evening to all. So on behalf of Tibet House, Cultural Center of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, New Delhi, and the Director Geshe Toji Tamdullah, I would like to extend a warm welcome to Mr. Claude Arpi, historian, Tibetologist, and Director of Pavilion of Tibetan Culture at Auroville, our chairperson, Professor Amarjiva Lochan, Joint Dean of International Relations and Foreign Students, University of Delhi, our distinguished guests, all the participants and students who are gathered here today. Venerable Geshe Tamdullah was very much looking forward to the lecture, but owing to his numerous travels within India and abroad, he could not make it today. So coming back to today's topic, the relations between India and Tibet from 1947 to 1962, this period marked a significant event in Tibetan history when His Holiness the Dalai Lama and many Tibetans escaped from their homeland and subsequently settled in India in 1959. Since then, Tibetan people have faced many challenges and hardships, but have also shown resilience, strength, and determination in preserving our culture, language, and traditions. India has played a crucial role in providing a home and support to the Tibetan community in exile, and many Tibetans have contributed to the country's social, cultural, and economic development. We are very grateful for the presence of Mr. Claude Arpi here today and for the overwhelming number of audience. Without much ado, I would like to request our program coordinator to proceed with the event. Thank you.
Thank you, Kunjabla. Now I request our chairperson for today's event, Mr. Amarjiva Lochanji, to kindly address the gathering. And to briefly introduce Dr. Amarjiva Lochanji, he's currently the Foreign Student Advisor as well as the Joint Dean of International Relations at the University of Delhi. Professor Amarjiva supervises 8 PhD program research students in Buddhist studies at the university. He has also written extensively in various national and international journals and is part of the editorial board of 5 international journals. Professor Amarjiva Lochanji often writes on the syncretic nature of the religions in Southeast Asia, the role of the Brahmana priest in Thailand, for which he was awarded the 4th scholarship, Hindu-Buddhist art and the changing faces of Buddhism. Professor Amarjiva's academic publication includes 10 books or monographs and 51 research articles. Professor has widely traveled for academic reasons, both in the region and around the world. He's also a visiting professor at 3 academic institutions outside of India, besides being a board member of several religious and cultural studies centers in India and abroad. Thank you.
Tashidilek, I am really indebted to Professor Claude Arpi being here, sharing the dais with him. Meeting him in BC and then AD is a different thing. Before Corona and Anno Domini, whatever you can call, I met him in BC. And now this is a great occasion to have him here with us. Ladies and gentlemen, all great scholars here, I am personally also indebted to Geshe Dr. Damdul, because he had planned me to be part of this evening, and then he felt sick after coming back from Brazil, long trip, and I still remember him for the kindness to allow me to be here. As you see, today's topic is so important, very relevant, much relevant than 10 years ago, and its relevance will be much more by this evening, late evening, when Claude speaks, and he speaks beautifully on the subject, as we all know. Claude has been part of us in many ways. As you see, he has been prolific writer on the subject, which we are hearing from him today. He has held many positions like presence in the KM Karyappa chair. And also, I envy him. He is born in a beautiful place, Angulem. Sounds me like Angulimala area. I have been to Angulem one time. As a traveler, I travel quite a lot. It's a beautiful place. I'm very happy to hear that he's coming from a part of that. And when he has been writing on the subject, as you know, he has first-hand account, learning from the first-hand documents. The main grant and main award, what he got by those 4 volumes, is a great feast of academic eyes for all of us. I'm sure the great author of many books which have been published in many, at many locations, including Kalaman Levi, Haranan in India, and Pagi is the Kalman Levi. And Mittal publication, which was a very important highlighted book, if I remember, I saw in the World Book Fair long back, Born in Sin. That was a very catchy title, and it was very important for many of us to learn what the shape is there. And to my credit, I teach history and Buddhism, but I am not an expert into that, except that I have been to Tibet 2 times and then learned Tibetan language at Tibet House. Long back, don't ask me when, then I will know my age. So I'm trying to hide my age. So these are only 2 connections which I'm having at the moment. I don't want to stand longer with a great speaker and all of us. So I invite Claude to be telling us the story, which is very important to us to learn. Thank you so much.
Good evening, all. Thank you. I want really to thank Geshe Damdullah. He is not here tonight. He come from an old cold country and he got a cold, so very sorry. But some of my friends here also from Delhi also got a cold. So I think now it's universal like many things in the world. So I want to salute the representative of His Holiness Dalai Lama, Mr. Lobsang Shastri, Dubung Rinpoche, the previous director also, and all friends who have come here tonight. So the topic of my talk tonight is the relation between India and Tibet between 47 and 62. This is a very sad story, very sad. I think I worked 4 years in the USI, in the United Service Institution of India, with under the Karyapa chair for researching this. 4 volumes have come out of it, but it's a sad for the Tibetans because they lost their own independence. Tibet was fully independent country in 1947, and I will show some documents. And it's a sad story for India also, because India lost a peaceful border. And now, if we have in Ladakh, I mean, it's partly Tibet and part in Xinjiang, but in Arunachal, in Sikkim, in the central sector, in Uttarakhand, like Baravati, Chamoli, the life has changed totally, and the army is there everywhere. And I'll show this, how the Himalayan life has changed because of this event between 1947 and 62. And I'm thinking, for example, of the 700 or 800 ghost villages in Uttarakhand. So that's a very sad story. It has been quite painful because very often the history is written by the American or the British, and they have their archives. Like in 47, they walk away with the archives. And I really try very hard to find Indian documents. Very often the MEA is very jealous of its document and is not declassifying in time or not declassifying at all the things. But at one point in time, the Nehru papers were open, so it was a great source of knowledge, of Indian knowledge was happened. Because remember that only India was represented in Lhasa between 1947 and 1962, and the daughter of one of the consul general, Mrs. Mehta, is there tonight, and she's born in Tibet, and her father was the only witness to the tragedy of March 1959, when His Holiness Dalai Lama had to leave. So you have to remember there was a very strong presence, and I will go about it. But before I start, the contacts are so old that they said more than 10 million years ago, the Indian plate came and collided with the Asian continent, and the Tethys Sea, which was in Tibet, got elevated at 5,000-meter altitude, and it became the Tibetan Plateau. That was the first connection. But it created the great Himalayan range. But Himalaya is a very porous border. and all the people, whether from Ladakh or from northeast, from what is today Arunachal, or for Sikkim, travel constantly. They went to study in Tibet, they trade in Tibet, they went in pilgrimage in Kailash Mansarovar or in Sari, and that was a very porous, and there was very deep connection. And the tragedy that in 1960, after the war, the border war is between India and China, this porous border was absolutely closed. And today, Tibetan can't even walk back and come to India. So that's really a big tragedy. And something which motivated me deeply also, that is the Chinese propaganda, that they, for immemorial ages, times they say that they were in Tibet, that Tibet was part of China, which is, and it's not true. But today, if you read the Chinese media, you'll see hundreds and hundreds of articles on archaeology. And they are doing what I call political archaeology. They want to prove that since more than 5,000 years, Tibet was part of China, which is not correct. And they have just totally forgotten all the exchanges between the Himalayan belt and in particularly in the central sector of the border in Uttarakhand or in Ladakh or in Himachal Pradesh, but also in Sikkim and in the northeast. So this has to be countered. And it's one of the motivations I spent 4 years of my life doing this research. Now, just this picture speaks by itself. Huh? What do you say? The pointer.
Yeah, the next one, yes.
You see the landmass of Tibet is 25% of the People's Republic of China. Now, if you have add what China calls the minority, if you add Xinjiang, earlier it was called Xinjiang, Eastern Turkestan. If you add Mongolia, you have 2/3 of the landmass of People's Republic of China, which are a minority. And someone was asking me how many Tibetans or Uyghur or Mongol have ruled their own so-called autonomous region. 0. Only Han Chinese have been ruling. So I think China, they can do whatever propaganda they want, but this they cannot change because since 1950, 59, 62, there never been party secretary of Tibetan origin in Lhasa. So that's a fact. And now I start with my talk on before independence. But before, I have to mention that the border, because today it's very hot topic in India since May 2020, when the Chinese PLA entered 5 areas in Ladakh, and more recently in the Yangtze sector of Arunachal Pradesh. India had to mass several divisions, 3-4 corps on the border, and while in 1947 there was not even a policeman. You could walk from India, from Uttarakhand via all these passes, Nitila, Manala, Lipuk Lake, Dharmala. You just walk without any ID. Of course, there's no Aadhaar card at that time, but you don't have to show who you are. You don't have to. And similarly, all the Tibetans were crossing and coming to Bodh Gaya or Lumbini, which is in Nepal, because if it's Nepali here, they'll be upset if I said it. And but all the sites, the Buddhist sites in Bihar, they were walking and just nobody would ask them anything. A border was delineated in 1914 because the British felt that we should have a border on a map with Tibet. And the reason is that in 1910, the warlord of Sichuan entered Lhasa. The 13th Dalai Lama has to take refuge in Kalimpong, and it rang alarm bells in London. So they said, let's have a border on a map. So during the Shimla Convention, which was originally to demarcate the border between Tibet and China, it had nothing to do between India, British India, and Tibet. Separately, the Tibetan Prime Minister Lochen Chatra sat with Sir Henry McMahon, the Foreign Secretary of India, and put that map. And today, it's still the international border for India, though China claims still the foothills, the entire Arunachal Pradesh. But what is interesting on that here, you have one of the many minutes of all the tens of 30, 40 meetings they had between the British plenipotentiary, the Tibetan, and the Chinese. And the three representatives of China, Tibet, and British India sat on the same level. You can't see because it's too small, but the name of Lochen Chatra, Ivan Chen, the Chinese representative, and Sir Henry McMahon are exactly on the same level. It means that China at that time, they sat 6 months with their colleagues of Tibet and colleagues of British India. They never said anything about it. So now when they say that since immemorial time, Tibet has been part of China, that is not shown by the documents. Now, what was the British policy for Tibet? Once the Chinese foreign minister, Dr. Song, in 1943, went to London and he asked, and the British government gave a note. They say since the Chinese Revolution of 1911, when the Chinese forces were withdrawn from Tibet, Tibet has enjoyed a de facto independence. She has been since regarded herself as in practice completely autonomous and opposed Chinese attempt to reassert the control. So that was the policy in 1943, and in 1949, means 2 years after India's independence, and 1 or 2 months after Mao Zedong took over China and declared the People's Republic of China from Tiananmen Square, the British Parliament reiterated that this note of 1943 was still the British policy for Tibet. So Tibet for British was de facto independence. So India became independent, and here Tibet, I think, did a very, very big blunder. You see, one of the weaknesses of the Tibetan state is the regency, or the gap between the time when Dalai Lama is born and when the time he is able to rule. And His Holiness is born in 1935. In 1950, when the trouble started for Tibet, he was 15 years old. And in November 1950, the Tibetan government decided to make him the temporal leader officially. He went on in Lhasa, he was enthroned as a temporal and religious leader of Tibet. But during these 15 years, and I'm not sure that a boy of 15 years is able to rule a state like Tibet, who had facing an enemy like China. But between these 15 years, there was only regents who fought between themselves, and there was some administrator, and nobody wanted to take the responsibility. They said during the minority, if we commit a blunder, after that, when the Dalai Lama will become an adult, we will be punished. But the blunder they committed, it's when the Indian government, in July, just 1 month before independence, the takeover was going to take place on 15th of August 1947. The government of India wrote to Lhasa, to the Dalai Lama's government. There was a foreign bureau which was corresponding to the Ministry of External Affairs. They said the government of India would be glad to have an assurance that it is the intention of the government of Tibet. This says government of Tibet to continue relation on the existing basis until new arrangements are reached on matter that either party may wish to take up. So it means that they were reiterating officially that the map which has been signed, the agreement, the border agreement which has been signed in 1914 was a valid treaty. And instead of accepting, maybe the future would have been totally different for the Tibetan. Maybe our Tibetan friend would not be here today, but they refuse. They say, no, British India has taken many of our territories. They spoke of lost territories. Lost territories means like Darjeeling, Kalimpong, and Tawang area. But it was the wrong move. It was a huge blunder from the Tibetan government side, because they should have, as requested by the Indian government, they should have said, okay, we agree to the treaty, let's renegotiate part of it. Suppose they didn't agree on Tawang, which was signed in 1914, they could easily have said, okay, we ratify what has been signed in the past, let's renegotiate some part of it as the British has suggested. And Mr. Richardson was the British representative, the head of the mission in Lhasa. And in 1947, he became the Indian head of the mission because India didn't have people knowledgeable enough to run the show there in Lhasa. So for 3 years, he represented India. He wrote that the Tibetan government acknowledged the message, but didn't reply till June of 1948. Nearly 1 year, 11 months to acknowledge that the Tibet had a treaty agreement with British India. That's a huge thing which was wrong. And one time I asked His Holiness if it was a blunder. He said, yes, it is my strong feeling. At that time, the Tibetan government should have sent a strong delegation to celebrate the independence of India. Of course, it was a big mistake. And somehow, Tibet still pay. I mean, but every country is doing mistakes, so you cannot say that. First of all, we can't rewrite history. What has been done, but we should learn from history. And I think it's good that to have the research history and publish history, because we should learn. Though, unfortunately, very unfortunately, we cannot rewrite. Now, what was the Indian presence in Tibet in 1947? India had a full-fledged mission. Mission means it had the rank of an embassy. When you see the first report of the Ministry of External Affairs and Commonwealth, you see that the mission in Lhasa had the same rank than the mission in all the countries. And 3 big trade agencies, one in Yatong in Chumbi Valley, adjacent to Sikkim, very close to Sikkim. In Yatong, for example, I think I'll show some pictures after that. There was 150 Indian shops. Marwari traders had shops, and you could import whatever you wanted. You want a car, they'll dismantle it in Kalimpong or in Gantok. They take it over Jalepla or Natula, usually Jalepla, and reassemble it. You had Rolex watch, whatever you want to eat, even food, they would import it. So that was the first agency. The second agency was in Gyanse, which is between Lhasa and the Indian border. And the third one was very, very important agency was in Gartok. Gartok is in western Tibet. It's north of Himachal Pradesh today. And the trade agent, Indian trade agent, was really monitoring the trade and also act as a judge or any dispute with the Indian traders from Garhwal or Kumaon or Kinnaur or Lahore. They were like judiciary in that area, even between Tibetan and people from the Himalayan belt, and they had a very, very important role. And they were moving from one of these trade marts to another. So here you have the picture Over the years, I've collected hundreds of these old pictures. That is one of the dark bungalow that India had. There are 12 dark bungalow, which were on the route from Sikkim to Lhasa for the officers visiting or any person wanting to visit Tibet. They could stay one night and they had all the facility and they'd cook everything there. And here, apart from the trade agents in the mission, you had a military mission. Military mission means a small detachment first from the Maratha light infantry and later on from the Jats. A major or a captain, the commanding officer, and but it showed that India's presence. And for example, that picture has been taken in 1951 when the Dalai Lama took refuge for a few months in Chumbi Valley. The Indian soldiers, they give him a guard of honor and they accompanying him. So it was 70, 80 soldiers. They couldn't stop the Chinese or do anything like that, but it was a symbol of Indian presence in Tibet. And just yesterday, I found the report of the Ministry of External Affairs and Commonwealth. And you know, like even today, they are doing a yearly report. They publish it, presented in a parliament. Now today, there's 300 or 400 pages. At that time, there was about 30, 40 pages. The first report, 48, 49, there's 30 pages. But they said, they gave the relation with each nation, no? European nation or Asian nation or China or Soviet Union, like that. So they said Tibet, our relation with Tibet are conducted through the political officer in Sikkim and the Indian mission in Lhasa. There is also a trade agent in Gyantse. So they have forgotten the trade agent in Yatong and in Gartok, but it shows that in that report is absolutely the same level, the representation in Lhasa. Of course, there was only maybe 15, 20 officers, but still it was like an embassy. So here you have the Dekilinka, which was an Indian mission in Lhasa. Here you have the mission in the Chumbi Valley in Yatong, which is a very, very beautiful house, which was where the Indian trade agents lived. And here you have a hospital also in Yatong. They had a hospital in Gyantse in Yatong, India, and were looking after the Tibetan population. It was very popular because at that time it was the only hospital available and only modern treatment that the Tibetan could get, so a lot of people would get. And you have the picture of Mr. Richardson, which for 3 years, though Britisher, served as head of the mission. And there was a post of a political officer in Sikkim, and which is a very important post because that officer was a senior ICS, Indian Civil Service, Mr. Harish Vardayal, who became later ambassador in Nepal, and very, very smart ICS officer. And he visited Tibet in 1949. And he visited all the places. Like, for example, in India had this wireless equipment, and in Lhasa, in Gyantse, and in Yatong. And a lot of officers, you see them playing here in the snow in Yatong, were posted there. And till a few years ago, we had very often in IIC Mr. K.C. Jaure, who had been for several years posted in Gyantse, in Yatong, and Mrs. Chiba Fathers was also there for 2 years, from 57 to 59. He was posted in Tibet. So this was very alive. And now, just to show the relation between India and Tibet, when Harishwar Dayal went, he agreed, his government agreed to supply weapons and ammunition to the Tibetan government. So 104 Bren guns and ammunition, 168 Sten gun, all rifles, 1,200, some pistols, but it was for defensive purpose, and they refused anti-aircraft guns and mortar. But this was delivered. So till 49, 50, early 50s, India was supplying arms and ammunition to the Tibetan government for defending itself. So, of course, when the PLA came in October of 1950, the Tibetan army was no match to the very well-trained soldiers of Mao Zedong, the People's Liberation Army. But that trade was thriving. There was, for example, every 3 years, there was a caravan from Ladakh. Very, very big preparation, and Ladakhi were bringing goods in Tibet and bringing some presents for the Dalai Lama. So, apart from the trade agency that I mentioned in Gartok, there was trade marts. These trade marts were dedicated to one area in Uttarakhand, or one area in Ladakh, or one area or in Himachal Pradesh. So every traders, tribe, clan, they would go to a trade mart, stay several months, bring goods from Tibet in summer, and come back. And similarly, the Tibetan traders were coming in what is today Uttarakhand. So that was extensive trade, which slowly disappeared with the Chinese invasion. And you see that some of this village, I think it's near Munsiari, north of Munsiari, toward Dharmala, that village has been totally abandoned. That village was living only by the trade with Tibet. And there was a trade that Mr. Balwant Singh was the deputy Indian trade agency. He would go. They knew Tibetan. They were great guys. All these, many of them belonged to the Indian Frontier Administrative Service. I think something very good that Prime Minister Nehru did to create that Indian Frontier Administrative Service, and like Mr. K.C. Jaure, like Bob Catting, and like so many of these officers. Originally, most of them belonged to the army, and they left the army. They were sent on deputation to this Frontier Administrative Service. They served in Tibet. They served in the NIFA, in the Northeast Frontier Agency. They served in Sikkim also. So they were very adventurous. They could walk days and days, and in the snow, in the rain, and they really represented India extremely well. Unfortunately, one day, one Babu in Delhi said that this frontier service has not been sanctioned by the parliament. Therefore, that is not official service. So it has to be dismantled, dissolved. So, like it's happening all the time. They say, "Oh, sorry, we had not passed it in Parliament, so we had to dismantle." And these people were transferred to the IAS or IFS. I mentioned in the Chumbi Valley up to Gyanse, these beautiful dark bungalows, very well equipped for people, for officers to go to stay there for the night. And because India was also running the postal service, so the riders who were bringing the postal Tibet, one of the signs of Tibet's independence, Tibet had its own stamps, at its own currency, at its own flag, its own army, of course, its own language, its own script. And so the dark bungalow were outsourced to India, and Tibetan could send a letter from Lhasa, so it would take 3-4 days with the riders. They were very, very fast and changing horses in these dark bungalows. And India had also some water. I'll take it. One small village near the Kailash Mansarovar in the. Thank you. In 1684, there was a treaty between Tibet and Ladakh, and they agreed that to give Tibet gave one small village, which all the revenue of this village would go for putting diyas, butter lamps, in the temples around the Kailash, which was holy. So that village, Minsar. Actually, I did some research and I wrote a very long paper, but I think it still belongs to India. The problem is how to manage it. Already in the 50s, the political officer said that if we can't defend it militarily, and if we can't go there and collect the taxes or help them by developing the area, we might as well forget about it. And Nehru had given orders in 1953-54 when the Panchil was negotiated, please don't speak about this foreign, foreign for India. It was in foreign countries, because it said it could be, the French could say that, why you want to kick us from Pondicherry? Well, you people have a colony or one place which belongs to India in Tibet. So it was kept quietly, but I think technically it's still part of India, though India can't do anything about it. And not only that, the Bhutanese, they had eight or nine enclaves similarly. And I think during the talks, the border talks between Bhutan and China, they raised the issue many times. China didn't, of course, not interested to talk about that, but they did raise. I don't think ever India raised the issue of Minsar. And the Kailash Yatra, I mentioned that friend of the Prime Minister, that's Swami Pravadananda, went many times. He wrote very good books, detailed books. He produced maps of the Kailash, and that's still today the holy site for the Indian Hindus or Jains or Buddhists. And unfortunately, since 3-4 years, the yatra has stopped. There was an agreement, but it was on a very small scale that the agreement about 15 years, 20 years ago was reopened. Many people went, but it was few batches, 700-800 maximum. First via Lipuk Lake, which is a very, very tough one to trek. Only very fit people could go. And later on, they opened, but I think it lasted only 3-4 years. The one by car, via Natula, Chumbi Valley, and going by car till the Kailash. And because of COVID, because of the tension on the border in the southern Sikkim, that it was stopped by China, and it has not started again. But at that time, anybody could go and go around the Kailash. And there was another pilgrimage, which is not that well known, but I think it's a very, very important one, because it's you cross over from Tibet, which is occupied today by China. You follow the Sari-Chu, the Sari River. You pass a village called Migitum, which is in Tibet, and the next village is called Longju. And Longju has been disputed. It has been the site of the first clash between the Indian Army and the PLA in August 1959. So that pilgrimage go around that very holy mountain of Dakpashiri and go till the junction of the confluence of the Sari-Chu and the Subang Sari-Chu, and go back. And it goes to Yume, which is interesting because Yume is the first of the 650 or 700 so-called moderately well-off village that China has built all along the border. That village was adopted by President Xi Jinping, and it became the model village, and one of the ladies there became a deputy. She got all the award and the medals from Xi Jinping, and but that you may, there were seven people living there. And today there's 300-400 people. So people have come from outside, mainly Han people and PLA. That village, the people living, the family living there were tantric practitioners, and their job was to open innerly the road to the pilgrimage and to make sure that the pilgrim, the yatris, would not suffer too much because hundreds of people would die in that the road. Today still, it was the last district, that's Upper Subansari, that Taksin, the last circle without no road till 2 years ago. I think now one road goes from Gelesing and that confluence and now one road goes to Maja. So that was extremely difficult to access. So much so that one of the Indian Foreign Administrative Service, Major Krishnatri, was posted there. He couldn't go beyond Limeking in 1956. And only in 1957, one Captain Selo, also from the Indian Frontier Administrative Service, he managed to walk to Longju. So just to say that these areas were extremely difficult to access, they are still, but today at least a road is going. So at one time, when before it started the confrontation between China and India, I had proposed as a confidence building measure that this yatra should be reopened. Of course, not today is no question as long as the Chinese troops are still occupying part of Ladakh, but it would have been interesting to open it for Tibetan pilgrim or Chinese pilgrim or Indian pilgrim, just to give a special permit to do the what they call the Rongkor, the large pilgrimage. Just to, the British, they published just before independence a map. I think it's Mr. Richardson who collected the data, show the Tibetan influence in Nifa, in today Arunachal. You see, it's very minimal, because when China today claims the entire Arunachal, and Tibetan influence doesn't mean that it's Tibetan. You can have, because it's more a Buddhist influence, like there's a Buddhist influence in Ladakh, like there was a Buddhist influence in Kinnaur, or even in Sikkim. There's many places in the Himalayan belt which have a Buddhist influence, but even the influence is very limited to only 10%. So how can China today pretend that the entire Arunachal belongs to them since immemorial time? I think it's something they discover when India started protesting for having done a road on the Aksha-Chin. They have started raising this issue as a bargain for one day, hoping for a swap, that India would recognize their occupation of the Aksha-Chin, and they would say, okay, you can keep Arunachal because it's yours. So this has never officially happened, but if you take the line of actual control, it follows more or less the McMahon line. So all these areas of Tawang, Menchuka, Geling Tuting, or Wallong are in India. Though they have Buddhist Gompa and people are Buddhist, but it doesn't mean that automatically. I think Sardar Patel, the Deputy Prime Minister, saw very early that there was a problem with China. And in June 49, means nearly 1.5 years before the first troops enter in eastern Tibet, he wrote to the Prime Minister, we have to strengthen our position in Sikkim as well as in Tibet. The farther we keep away the communist force, the better. Tibet has been long been detached from China, and anticipate that as soon as the communists have established themselves in the rest of China, and it was before Mao Zedong declared the People's Republic on October 1st. It was 4 or 5 months before. They will try to destroy its autonomous existence of Tibet, they speak. You have to consider carefully your policy towards Tibet in such a circumstance and prepare from now for that eventuality. It was just brushed aside. Nehru said it irrelevant. I should have also mentioned the answer from the Prime Minister. He didn't see at all any danger coming from that side, because he thought that India and China have a common destiny and should be together and work together for the peace in the world, and like very lofty ideas. But unfortunately, Patel was more down to earth, and he had seen what was happening. That was 1 year before he wrote this very detailed letter of Nehru about the loss of a peaceful frontier. So, 1st of October, Mao Zedong took power in China, and immediately, 1 month after, he sent the People's Liberation Army to Xinjiang, which was Eastern Turkestan, which was under the Russian influence. Now, I have never understood, I've never found in the archive what is the reason why Stalin gave his green light to Mao Zedong to take over Xinjiang. Probably the reason is that he thought that Mao Zedong would do the dirty work, and they would still control Xinjiang. There was 3 or 4 Soviet advisors in Xinjiang, so they thought that the new China, Communist China, has not the power to control anything, and they thought, let Mao Zedong do the dirty work, like they wanted to do it, that Stalin wanted Mao to do it in Korea, and we will after take over. But I've never found any document proving that point, but I think it's correct. Interestingly, India had a consulate general in Kashgar, and that consulate general was inherited from the British consulate general, so it was divided in 2. Half was for Pakistan, and half was for India, and there was a central hall for the reception and thing. One side there was Nehru, or Gandhi, and there's Mohammed Ali Jinnah on the same hall. I think this very unique building, and of course in 1950 the Pakistani and Indian were kicked out, and China took over this. So 1 year later, in October of 1950, Mao entered Tibet. He entered Tibet, Western Tibet, with 135 cavalrymen only. It means that Tibet was a very weak state, was not able to defend itself. 135 cavalrymen. Of course, later on they brought reinforcement, but 135 cavalrymen controlled the entire eastern Tibet, which is very huge. They put some garrison and slowly came to the Indian border. And from the other side, they entered from the Xining, from the First Army. Xi Jinping's father, Xi Zhongshun, was the political commissaire at that time of Marshal Peng Duan, and also the main army, the 18th Army, came from Sichuan, from Yan and in Kansai, and also a little bit from Yunnan, some other. So Tibet was occupied. And Mao Zedong, he was a greater strategist maybe of the 20th century. He planned it in 2 stages. First, a military stage. He's demolished the Tibetan army. 4,000 to 5,000 soldiers were from the 7 to 19 minutes, 12 days. There was no Tibetan army anymore. And the second one, he said, we'll negotiate it. He called some Tibetan representative in Lhasa and forced them to sign the 17 points agreement. And the first article was Tibet has rejoined motherland finally. So that was the end of Tibet. His Holiness always said that it was with a forged seal. It was done under duress, therefore it was not valid. But de facto, China had occupied. Whether it was valid or not, once China has occupied one place, it's very difficult to kick them out. I mean, India is facing this issue in Depsang or Demchok today, or Bhutan is facing also the issue. So whether it's valid or not, they do it, and after that. And when Tibet was occupied in October 1950, the Eastern Tibet, China, India, Delhi said it's regrettable what you have done. It's only reaction, it's a regret, but it was not enough to stop the advance of Mao Zedong. But just before Sardar Patel passed away, he passed away 1.5 months after the Chinese PLA entered Tibet. He created a committee under the Deputy Defense Minister, General Himmat Singh Ji, and he decided that Tawang, which is under treaty, 1914 treaty, was part of India, the administration of Tawang should be taken over. He sent a Assam Rifle with Major Bob Getting of the Indian Frontier Administrative Service, and since then, Tawang has been under India's administration. Before, Tibet used to Tibet used to collect taxes from the monastery in Tawang, but there was no administration as such. They never did a hospital or schools or anything for the Monpa or roads or anything. They were just more grabbing, taking taxes, taking the corvée, forcing the Monpa to provide transportation free and things like that. So somehow when Major Keating went, that's why he's still a hero today. If you go to Tawang, they put recently a memorial. They have started in the university near Tanga, they have started the Bob Keating Center of Excellence of Himalayan Studies. So he's a hero because they believe that they are different from the Tibetan, and Bob Keating helped them. There was not a shot, nobody was killed or anything like that. And since then, Tawang is part of the Union of India. So I mentioned this 17 points agreement, which was signed under duress. The only thing that Indian Prime Minister could say 3 weeks later, the only account that we had was some celebration in Beijing, in the sense of some meeting or another occasion. After signing the treaty, was celebrated by toasts and various people, including both the Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama. Now, at that time, the intelligence, Indian intelligence about what was happening in Tibet was really, in China, was very minimal. So the fact that they didn't know that an agreement had been signed, that though it had been published in the Chinese media, just speaks about itself and does shows how much the government of India was following what was happening. The tremendous events happening in China, they would not follow only a few months later. And in September, the 51 PLA entered Lhasa, and they call it the liberation of Tibet. But still today, the Tibetans are asking themselves, from what have they been liberated? It was the question that in December 1950, Nehru said, it seems Tibet has been liberated, he said in Parliament, in Lok Sabha, but from what I don't know. So still today we don't know what liberation the Tibetans have. But it's true that from that time the Chinese rule, the communist rule, has been prevalent in Tibet. And just a small incident, during the campaign in 1950, 2 Indian nationals were taken prisoner, and India discovered only 2 years later. And China refused. They were from Kalimpong, Darjeeling, and Gantok. So they said, no, they are not. They are Chinese national. We will not free them. After 6 months of discussion and negotiation, finally they were sent back to India. So it shows again that the poor intelligence, not knowing that some of your own people have been taken away, have been made prisoner in communist China, just speaks by itself. But I must say that the Indian diplomat, it took months, but when they managed really to get them freed, ultimately. Now, the first thing that China did was roads. And a very strange incident took place. All these Chinese troops, up to 20,000 troops, started occupying the Tibetan plateau. And for centuries, Tibet had not faced any starvation because they were doing sufficiently barley growing and for feeding the people. But the Chinese PLA, the first thing they took, whatever granary, whatever stock there was, they took it by force, and later on there was nothing left. And Chinese are also rice-eating. So they asked India, can you help us and supply rice? And for nearly 2-3 years, India fed the PLA, which had occupied Tibet and which had come to India's border. So that's very strange, I think, in the history of military history, that you feed the army which has come to close to the your border and threatening your borders. Actually, that was very funny when you go into details. How many mules had to be, thousands and thousands of mules had to be taken from each village in southern Tibet, and you sent to Kalimpong to bring the rice to the PLA. And building roads started. First, the road between Qinghai through the Amdo province and Lhasa, and at the same time between on the eastern side, Sichuan and Lhasa. And I must say that Chinese were extremely good. I mean, it's quite admirable the work they did on the road. And today they are still so much in advance on India, though the BRO recently has done much better work. But the way they are doing tunnels, they are doing bridges, they are doing roads in Tibet, particularly in Aksai Chin. Aksai Chin is easier, it's flat. But in all the areas on the border, and like in Metok Song, Metok is similar terrain than some of the part of Arunachal. They have been extremely efficient, and tens of thousands of young Chinese died doing these roads. But for them, for Mao Zedong, if people died, he always said they can be replaced. When he met first Nehru in '54 in Beijing, when Nehru went, Mao Zedong, I think, to test Nehru, is mentioned about the atomic bomb. He said that if atomic bomb, if you kill a few hundred millions of Chinese, I can replace them. There's no problem. So that's the way, the mindset. So these few tens, maybe 20, 30,000 soldiers who died making the road, that was nothing, because the more important, it was to have the road coming first to Lhasa and next to the border. And something happened in 1952 that is not known usually in history. It's not be recorded because it was not announced in Indian media. It was not permission from or ratification from the Lok Sabha was not taken. Nobody knew in India that the Indian full-fledged mission that I mentioned at the beginning became a consulate general. Means downgrading that mission, that full-fledged, means Tibet was no more an independent country, because the consulate general in Lhasa thereafter depended of the Indian embassy in Beijing, no more a direct connection with the Ministry of External Affairs in Delhi. And Mr. Shumul Sinha who had been a very, very brilliant diplomat. His Chinese speaking, was the last Indian head of the mission. He said, I'm not interested. In August 1952, he left. Later on, that Mr. Sinha wrote a report about the threat, the Chinese threat over the Nifa of the Arunachal today. And each time he was dismissed by a prime minister who said that Mr. Sinha doesn't understand anything about geopolitics and the larger perspective of India's politics. So he was a great man for me, and I read all his reports. And I actually am told that in 1959, when the incident in Longzhou, when the Chinese attacked the Indian troops in Longzhou in August 59, Nehru said that, where's Mr. Sinha? He was right. Call him back. But Sinha didn't. He was a dejected man, and he refused to. He was, I think, ambassador in Netherlands or something like that, and he refused. But the main instrument has been Sardar Panikar, who has been the main advisor of Nehru for the China policy, and we had a very bad influence in the sense that he thought that absolutely we have to be friends with China at any cost. So the Hindi Chini Bye Bye, I think, has its origin with Sardar Panikar, the Indian ambassador in here. There's Mr. Sinha having lunch with the Tibetan ministers. Panchil was the turning point because for the first time, black on white on a treaty, on a piece of paper signed by both governments. Panchil was something which is, these 5 principles were added at the last minute to make this treaty, this agreement look nice. But basically the agreement was about trade and pilgrimage in Tibet. It was the trade regulation and the pilgrimage regulation for that agreement. But the title of the agreement was Agreement between the Republic of China and of India and the People's Republic of China on trade and intercourse between Tibet region of China and India. For the first time in a treaty and an agreement, it was mentioned that Tibet was a region of China. It had never been before, but many of the Indian MPs say that's the best thing that Nehru ever did. He did that Panchil, and still today China speaks about the Panchil, the 5 principles of coexistence, and no interference in others' affairs and others on others' territory. That was a very clever move from Chou Enlai, because by saying there's no interference in others' territory, once India had said it was a part of China, it was Tibet region of China. After there's 1,000 of letters in a white paper saying, but you're interfering in our own affairs because you have said that Tibet is part of China, and now you try to interfere, which was happening in Tibet mainly when there were problems with Indian Trade Agency and like that. Please don't interfere. You have signed the Panchil agreement. And just 2-3 months after, the first intrusion started in central sector in Barauti, and since then it has been continuing till December when it happened in Chumi Yangtze in Arunachal Pradesh. So the road I've mentioned, and one thing I should say that China, the first years of occupation of the Tibetan plateau, they didn't realize that the importance of the McMahon line. So much so that when Nehru met Chou Enlai in 1955 what is called this Bangun, he said, I have no problem with the McMahon line. I don't like the connotation, the British connotation of McMahon. If you change the name, I will agree, but let me ask the Tibetan. But he never asked the Tibetan. But it's only in 57, 58 that for the first time China discovered the border in area like Tsona, or Ningtri, or Lhotse, all these areas, they discover very late that the border areas. And because before they was busy doing the main roads and stabilizing, what they call stabilizing the Tibetan rebellions, which has started in eastern Tibet in Kham. So they realized the importance of that line and that border very late, and progressively they reinforced that border, and in 59 they attacked India in Longju. So, but all these years life was going on, and like many monks, 400-500 monks from Ladakh used to study in Tibet, similarly from the Tawang monastery, similarly from Sikkim, and like Kushok Bakula Rinpoche, the head lama of Ladakh had visited Tibet. He studied in Tibet, and after visited again Tibet, he visited all the monastery. And the second lama, actually the head lama of Ladakh, Tasang Repa of Emis, the abbot of Remis, is still in Tibet today. He's 83 or 84. He went to study, like many of these Ladakhi monks, but the Chinese kept him, and today he is not allowed to visit Ladakh. But if you go to Emis Gompa in Ladakh, you'll see his picture everywhere. He is still the head lama of Emis, and somehow was considered as head lama of Ladakh. Of course, Bakula Rinpoche was more a political leader. He became MP, and he was representing the people of Ladakh. He was very close to Nehru. So all these people continued to go to Tibet in 1957, in 1958. Progressively, as I mentioned earlier, this Indian Frontier Administrative started walking to the border. Of course, after bobcatting started in 51, the administration of Tawang and all this area were strengthened, but they also discover the border, in the sense that in 1914, when the line was drawn by Unwin McMahon, he had sent two young officers, Captain Morshin and Captain Belay. One is intelligence, was a survey to find out where the border should be. That line was drawn very quickly, and it's only 51, 52, 53 that all these officers walked to the border and really marked the border on proper maps. His Holiness and Panchen Rinpoche were invited for the 2,500 years of the Buddha Jayanti in 1956. It was like last attempt to find a solution, and His Holiness asked Nehru if he could take refuge, but Nehru said, no, you go back to Tibet, you try one more time. There was a very, very powerful section of the Tibetan officials, like Mr. Chakapa, Mr. Tuptenpala was the Lord Chamberlain, who wanted him to stay in India and take refuge at that time. And of course, the Panchen Lama was more influenced by China, so he returned immediately. His Holiness stayed till February 57, and finally he went back. By that time, Chuen Lai was so nervous, he visited thrice India in 2 months to have negotiation with Nehru and to make sure that the Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama returned to Tibet. And he promised at that time that the so-called reform that they had planned, means to the communism, what you say, that Tibet would become fully communist area. He said, we will postpone it. He said, we can postpone it up to 50 years if Tibetans are not happy. But it didn't last 50 years, it lasted 2 years. In meantime, the political officer, Apapant, who was quite a remarkable person, visited Tibet. He visited thrice Tibet in 55, 56, and 57. In 57, he did the film. And unfortunately, I think this government should help to show this film to everybody, because it shows that Indian presence and how well the Indian diplomats were received. I think there's the father of Mrs. Chiber, who is here, who is on the picture. And I think your mother also is on that picture. And so the Indian presence was still strong, but Apapant was a philosopher. He realized that something was happening. He said, with each visit, my impression has been confirmed that Tibet is a country forcibly, with the might of military strength, occupied by Chinese. But of course, in Delhi, he reported to the Ministry of External Affairs, but at that time, nobody thought that it would go bad for India also and for Tibet. So Pant noted that the military establishment around Yatong, Gyaltsen, and Chigatse have been growing, and this year it is very difficult to estimate that around Lhasa, it's not very difficult to estimate that around Lhasa alone, there is even more than 15,000 troops stationed in Tibet. So I think the different Consul General, Mr. Shiv Shankar Menon's father, P.N. Menon, Major Chiber, after Mr. Cole, and the last one, Mr. Arvindeo, realized that and did report in detail to Delhi about the strengthening of the military presence in Tibet, but it was ignored time and again. And from this report, I did that map, and I put the strengths of the military, like in Sona, which is north of Tawang. There was 3,000 troops in 1957. So I collected from different reports that one or two of these reports were available in the National Archive of India, and I did that map. And so you see the presence that, unfortunately, again, it was ignored by the government till it was too late in 1962. And Nehru wanted to go to Lhasa, but the Chinese government didn't allow him, because by that time, by 1958, there was a lot of the guerrilla. The Chuchikanruk, the Kampa guerrilla, was controlling part of southern Tibet, and Nehru was allowed to cross over Tibet to go to Bhutan, to meet the king of Bhutan and visit Bhutan. So he stayed 2 nights in Yatong, in that beautiful trade agency, and he was accompanied by Indira Gandhi, and the Tibetan minister came from Lhasa, Mr. Zukang, and the Chinese representative also, one of the General Tan, one of the main PLA general, also came and to receive. And here you have a picture of the shops I was mentioning, all these streets with the shops. You see Nehru speaking to the traders, the Indian traders in Yatong. So still in September 1958, there was a strong presence, but at that time the business was really declining, and 1 year later it would more or less finish. And he met some of the High Lama there in Yatong, and he had dinner with all the Chinese representative and the Tibetan representative. And uprising, I think we have the account. While doing research, sometimes you spend months and months and you don't find anything. But the day I found the report of Major Chiber, who wrote the detailed account of what happened in 1959. Because today you read the CIA book or the American book, they say they have done everything. They were not there. Only the Indian Consul General was there with his staff, and they knew what has happened, the detail of what happened, how many thousands of people were killed between the March 10, the day of the uprising, the Tibetan uprising, and March 25th or 24th, when all the so-called rebellion were finished, and they had taken control the entire Lhasa. It's interesting because you see in Tibet, all Tibet, the clergy was very powerful. The aristocracy was very powerful. They were controlling all the administration. But the uprising of 1959, of March 59, it's the masses. It's the people of Tibet. It's, I think, only time that the entire population of the capital of a country, there was about 30,000 people living, Tibetan living in Lhasa. They all surrendered the noble Inca to defend the life of His Holiness. They feared that His Holiness would be kidnapped and taken to a Chinese camp and taken to the mainland. So this, it's the masses, it's not the clergy or the aristocracy who fought for the defending His Holiness. It's the entire population. And today China is speaking of the masses always. Yeah, but they don't know what is masses. For them, masses is equivalent to the party only. But here in that case, it's the entire population of Lhasa who fought and defended His Holiness. And of course, there was a very big battle. The estimate is 3,000-4,000 people died in a few days, and there was 3 centers, one near Noble Inca, the Summer Palace, one in Chakpori, the School of Medicine, and one of the temple, Ramoche. So His Holiness ultimately had to escape, and a new life started. He crossed the border. He was received by the assistant political officer in Tawang, Mr. T.S. Murthy, on 31st of March 1959, and since that time, since now 64 years, he is in exile in India. But government has reiterated time and again, the Indian government is an honored guest, and the government of India has always looked after his security, after his travel, whenever he's traveling less because of age, but whenever he travels, the government pays the entire expenses in the hotel, in the security. When he visited us in Auroville, for example, there was 400 constables. All this paid by the central government, and I don't say that the 400 constables were very useful, but the PSO, is Z plus category. They are the trained energy people. They are also taken care by the government. So I always link the border dispute with His Holiness crossing over into India. He took March of 59. He was taken by train to Uttar Pradesh, to Mussoorie first, and he had a long meeting with Nehru. I had found the transcript of this meeting. It was not very pleasant, I think, for His Holiness. Nehru was quite tough, spoke quite not very nicely, I must say. But he said three things. We'll give asylum to you and your people. Whoever crossed the border, will give. In the first month, 12,000 Tibetans came. But we will not give political support. At that time, His Holiness was thinking of appealing, and he did appeal to the UN in 59. He appealed again in 61 and 65, and we will never support your appeal in the UN. Only in 65, when Lal Bahadur Shastri was Prime Minister, India voted in favor of UN resolution for Tibet. In 1959 and 61, India abstained. But we will provide education and rehabilitation for your people. Whoever comes is welcome. And this they did, because today we have so many educated Tibetan. I think it's because of that decision. But the political angle, the political decision not to help Tibet has remained more or less as it was in 1959, though more recently, I think government of India slowly is opening that to the idea not to support independence of Tibet, but at least to help also politically, because they know that whatever concession, such a concession you do to China is not repaid. It's not, they don't even respect you for that. And progressively, the government is realizing this, so hopefully it will be changed. A new life started. That picture I've taken I wish Geshe-la was there. It's the School of Dialectics where he studied. His Holiness visiting this just with one secretary and one PSO, and that is Dharamsala, Claude Ganj, in the early days. So a new life started. Now, of course, the life is totally different. Tibetans are educated. And but that relation was so deep that the Tibetan felt at home. I'm aware that today many Tibetans want to go to in America or in the West, and there's been an exodus. I find it extremely sad, but it has been their second home in one way since that time, and because of what Nehru told His Holiness, but politically it is no. And by the Panchimel agreement was for 8 years only. In April of '62, it lapsed, and all these trade agency, particularly the beautiful one in Yatong, was taken by the Chinese and destroyed. For years and years, I've been asking people what has happened to the trade agency. I thought China would have kept it, but they destroyed it and they put their own building. And today the Indian mission in Lhasa is used by the PLA. I don't know if you can see here, but the Indian flag in 1962. I think in December of '62, I've never been able to find out why. I've asked time and again the MEA to show me the file, but I've spoken to different former foreign secretary. Nobody knows why. Suddenly, 1 month after the end of the war, after the ceasefire, someone decided to close down that and to reopen it. I know, for example, when Mr. Shiv Shankar Menon was ambassador in Beijing, he really tried, and later on he was foreign secretary, he tried to reopen, but China will not reopen immediately. Though the Nepalese have been given a consulate general in Lhasa, but India would not. And that's really, they should have not closed it in December. The war was finished. There was no reason, in my opinion, to close it down, because it's easy to close down, but to reopen is nearly impossible. And as I mentioned, that the clashes started just 2-3 months after His Holiness crossed the border, and that the first one is in Longju. Actually, this map is I should have put it bigger. This map is from 1960, from the Chinese, and they show the places which are disputed in that area. One is near Kenzemane. It includes Samdorongchu, where there were clashes in 86, 87. One is Yangtze, where the clash took place in December of last year. And one is Longju, which has been now fully taken by China. And there was another place called Tamade, which has been given by India because it was wrongly put under India's territory. And in April of '59, Mao Zedong said, let the Indian government commit all the wrong for now, but when the time comes, we will settle the account with them. And settling the account means the 1962 war. And it was never planned to be a long war. Mao wanted to slap India, and in any case, they had not the capacity to keep it beyond 1 month. The supply lines were too difficult to reapprovision from Tibet. It was the winter coming by mid-November, so unilaterally Zhou Enlai declared a ceasefire. The Longju incident, as I mentioned, now China has done one of these model villages, and Mao Zedong, he linked the fight against the rebellion, the Khampa rebellion in Tibet, with a future conflict with India. He said the Tibetan rebellion is a good thing as it could be used to train troops, the Tibet, against the masses. To harden the troops to combat readiness, his concept was suppress the rebellion while training the PLA troops. And actually, it's what happened. All the tactics, the military tactics used in 1962 in the Tawang sector, the encircle, or in Bomdela, for example, in the second part of the war, was the same one that he used in Tibet against the Tibetan rebellion. And there's one Chinese author, Zhang Jingli. She has found records in the PLA archive, local archives, and she has demonstrated the entire detailed tactics of the PLA were the same one which has been used against the rebellion, which was used in 1962. And of course, one can say that the 1962 war was partly due to the refuge that His Holiness has been given in India. And one of the reasons also that they withdrew, apart from the winter, was the deep resentment inside Tibet. The Panchen Lama had written this 70,000 character petition. Never in the history of the Communist Party of India, the leadership has received such a letter. There was a lot have been written about Marshal Penduhai writing a letter of 2 pages to Mao in 1959, and for that he was sacked and he was purged and he was killed eventually. And he was one of the most remarkable Chinese general. His Holiness told me one day that is my favorite Chinese general, Peng Duhai. But he wrote only 2 pages. Panchen Lama wrote 120 pages to detailing all what was wrong. And so this resentment within Tibet, I think, forced the Chinese to withdraw. And as a result of the 1962 war, the Special Frontier Force were created for a Tibetan army to one day to go back to Tibet. They never went back. They helped India in 1971 during the liberation war of Bangladesh. In many operations in the Siachen and elsewhere, they helped India. It has been kept very secretive for a reason that we can understand. But in 2020, they helped India to regain some of the ranges in the Kailash range in Ladakh near the Spangur and the Pangong Lake. So at the end, I just want to conclude. I had written a book maybe 25 years ago. I should revise it, but it was called The Karma of Tibet. So I say that we cannot rewrite history. His Holiness speaks always of karma. I don't know what wrong, many mistakes we can point out, like the division between the different schools of Buddhism, the division between the different provinces. But if you look at the history of mankind, every country has committed blunder or has committed wrongs. China has committed much more. So for some reason, Tibet had to pay a much more heavy price, and India has lost a peaceful border. Why Tibet, independent nation in 1947, became part of China, while all the nations of Asia, of Africa, who was under the yoke of the Western countries, France or Portugal or other country, became independent, and Tibet, who was independent, became under yoke of China and remains so. So that is very difficult. You can philosophically speak about the karma. His Holiness the 13th Dalai Lama had said, he had written his testament in 1933, 2 years before he passed away, and he said, and long and dark shall be the night, and he gave a very deep description of what could happen to Tibet, and if you don't follow the Dharma, he said. But that's one of the reasons. But every country has committed crime. France has committed crime. America has committed crime. Russia is committing or has committed crime also. Why it has happened to Tibet? is a mystery that I've not been able to solve. But I think what His Holiness said, the religion and the society of Tibet and India have developed in different lands, but Tibet is still a child of Indian civilization. So the tragedy is today that the Himalayan belt, that the Himalayan border is totally, not only totally closed, people cannot go from Demchok to Tashigang, or can't go to from Tawang to Lunse, but more and more troops have to be brought in to defend the border, because everyone, and I think the Indian army knows better than anybody that if you leave a vacuum, China will occupy it immediately and will find a reason. It has happened in Ladakh, it has happened in southern Sikkim. So, but it remains a child of Indian civilization, and we can hope that one day, there's no reason not to hope that one day it will happen again, because the relation is there. It has not been killed. And I think big change will happen in the world. It has started after with the COVID. Many things are happening in China. The way people look at China is different. All the Western nations start looking at China differently. 10 years ago, America and France supply a P4 lab in Wuhan. They would have never supplied that high technology lab to India. They supplied it to China because everyone trusted China. Look at today. After the COVID started from Wuhan, from that lab. Now China, more and more alliances are coming up to counter China. So things are changing. So maybe there's some hope. I don't know. I cannot speak about the future, but I think as human beings, I think the good should prevail one time. And in India, we say the truth should prevail, no? Satyameva Jayate. So hopefully something will change. But it may take some time, and we have to be patient. But that relation remains. This nobody can touch.
What a mesmerizing talk. Pages of history and history, learning, unlearning from the past. Thank you, Claude, for your wonderful presentation. I knew 101-minute lecture was one of the beautiful lectures under this series of Padampani, and I'm very grateful to you for taking this request from the center and house to do that. I was asked to have some 2 or 3 questions, but time is really now only 3 minutes before 8. Still, it will be nicer to have a couple of questions, just short one, please. Please.
Claude, I've always wondered about the CIA involvement in Tibet, because I believe that, sorry.
Could you introduce yourself for us?
My name is Ram, and I'm with Stat News Global. I've always wondered about the CIA involvement in Tibet. You remember that movie called The CIA's Involvement in Tibet? Remember that Shadow Circus, that movie done by Sonam or something? What was the CIA objective? I mean, why did they train these guys and then just let them go?
CIA is involved in everything. Now they say that it's America who provided India all the inputs to about the recent clash in Yangtze, and but India has the capacity and doesn't need this. So I think it's highly exaggerated, but it is true that the Tibetan guerrilla during the Cold War was trained in Colorado. Tibetans were trained, and but the day Mr. Kissinger started going to Beijing to prepare the visit of President Nixon in February '72 to Beijing, the Tibetans were dropped. So that helped a little bit the Tibetan for some time, but not that much. So that is very limited, but a lot of books have been written, and they are selling much better their, whatever they do that we do here in India. But I think it's exaggerated, but it is true that till 73, 74, when the Dalai Lama asked Mustang guerrilla to be dismantled, they help training and supplying ammunition. And some friends, I think they have exhibited maybe here, Ritu Tsarin and Tenzing Sonam. Tenzing Sonam is the son of the Tibetan who was doing the liaison with the CIA. Tsaring Lamo was minister of the Dalai Lama. I think they exhibited their exhibition here, which very, very good stuff. They have documents and equipment. But at the same time, it's limited what it could do for.
Thank you. Could you just have last question, please? And kindly introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm Hyungjin An from South Korea, currently studying PhD philosophy in Delhi University. Sir, thank you to give me such a wonderful lecture. And in brief, I want to ask you about the political strategy of China, political archaeology. Actually, in China, Xi Jinping said to Donald Trump that historically Korea has been a part of China. And Chinese Communist Party now don't consider both of North and South Korea as independent country. They think that we are just part of their Chinese region, which they lost after the Opium War. So how should we deal with this problem? It is really serious problem, which is really serious threatening of our nation. So I really want to ask your advice, sir. Thank you.
Yeah. So he needs your advice. He needs our advice for making a foreign policy of new style.
How can we deal with the political archaeology of China?
He wants to know from you how to handle political archaeology of China.
But everything is political in China, but the archaeology, they will show that Tibet has been part of China since now 5,000 years. Before they were saying 1,300 years. Now, last week there was that article 5,100 years.
Yeah.
They found the genomes and they study, and they said 90% come from China, from the east. And some come from the Central Asia also, but they forgot in that study to mention at all India, like there was no relation between India and the Tibetan plateau. But at the same time, it's also India's fault, in the sense that more archaeological studies, the Archaeological Survey of India should have spent more energy and time doing research in Ladakh or in Kinnaur or Spiti or in this area, and show that extensive relations, no, from maybe 5,100 years or so. So because it's existed, but not much. In Ladakh, there's some archaeological research taking place, mainly with French collaboration, but they are limited at the time of Richenzampo or like that. They don't go very deep in history. No? So India should put more energy into this, not to counter China, but just to show that the relations were existing. No?
Thank you. Thank you very much for this wonderful handling of the question. There is something else left at your end, or should I call it a day? Do you have? Yes, please.
Thank you so much, Dr. Amajiwalojanji, for chairing this program. And my heartfelt thanks to our speaker, Mr. Claude Arpi, for your very comprehensive, informative, and insightful take on today's topic and sharing your profound knowledge with us. I also want to extend my sincere gratitude to our wonderful audience and students over here for joining and making tonight's events a successful one. So we are very grateful for that. Finally, I extend my heartfelt gratitude to our Geshe-la for the constant guidance and support to enhance our capabilities. So last but not the least, I would like to thank my colleague, Tibet House colleague, for all the efforts and enthusiasm into putting all this together. Thank you. So we have, with this, we have come to the end of today's program, and I would like to request Professor Kavita, head of the department, Shiv Nadar University, to kindly offer a khatak and souvenir to our respected chairperson and speakers. Our chairperson, Dr. Amar Jivalojan ji. Our speaker for today's event, Mr. Claude Arpi. Thank you, Ajay Kavidila. So once again, thank you everyone for joining today's program. Before we leave, I have a small announcement to make. Tomorrow we are organizing an exhibition on the contributions of His Holiness the Dalai Lama to the world heritage and culture of Himalayan belt and Tibet. So we are organizing this exhibition tomorrow, and the inaugural session will start at 5:30 p.m. So I welcome you all for this exhibition tomorrow. Hope to see you all out there. Thank you once again. Have a great night.